Welcome to the Touching into Presence podcast.
This podcast is for people who are interested in bodywork, empowerment, and somatic-based practices.
I am Nikki Olson.
I'm Andrew Rosenstock.
We are certified Rolfers.
Collectively, we're trained in various movement and bodywork therapies with an emphasis on somatic awareness and client resilience.
Through conversations, our goal is to share and explore mind-body paradigms to offer empowerment possibilities.
It was such a pleasure to be in conversation today with Bob Schrei. Bob has 4 decades of experience as a student, apprentice, practitioner, and teacher of energy medicine. He's a Certified Advanced Rolfer, Biodynamic Cranial Sacral Therapist, and co-originator of SourcePoint Therapy. With a BA in Architecture and a Master's of Fine Arts, Bob also incorporated his lifelong interest in structure and pattern into SourcePoint Therapy, which he developed, refined, and tested for 10 years before beginning to teach in the United States and Europe. This process of refinement and development continues as SourcePoint Therapy evolves. From 1970 to 1985, Bob was a student and teacher at the Rochester Zen Meditation Center. As a former Zen teacher, Bob brings a unique perspective to the field of energetic healing and manual therapy, helping his students develop sensitivity to the subtleties of working with energy and bringing a heightened awareness to their healing work. Bob currently resides in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he maintains an active private practice of SourcePoint Therapy in addition to teaching it worldwide. In today's conversation, we spoke about Bob's history with Zen, esoterics and Rolfing, the 10 series as a ritual, how SourcePoint emerged, basics of SourcePoint, what is presence and embodiment, his artistic painting endeavors related to SourcePoint, and more. So with that, let's begin our talk.
Hey, Andrew.
Hi, Bob.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Hi, Nikki.
Hey, Nikki.
Good to see you, Nikki.
Likewise.
I'll say, Bob, I'm really excited. And when I sort of came up with the idea for this podcast, you were actually one of the people I really wanted to interview because I had heard a lot about SourcePoint. A lot of people I knew who had done training through the Rolf Institute or other places had taken it. Ray McCall was my seminar 3 or module 3 or phase 3, whatever it's called, teacher. Yeah. And so it was like kind of talked about. It was someone in my class who had done it. And every now and then I remember he said something about like the golden, she was at the table next to me and I was just thinking, what is the golden thread? And I have an esoteric background as well. So when I was thinking about who do we want to talk on the show with, you were there in my mind. So I'm really excited to have you here. And I haven't studied with you. Nikki has. She's had the blessing to, but I haven't. So I'd like to just hear a little bit about Bob, like what brought you to this work and then eventually in SourcePoint.
Okay. So my background in the background of SourcePoint, well, it's fairly complex. I spent 15 years full-time at a Zen center as a Zen practitioner and eventually as Zen teacher. And so I had that as my background. My first interest was even preceded that. I was during the late 60s, I helped edit an issue of what was then the Canadian Whole Earth Almanac. I don't know if you remember the Whole Earth catalog from the 60s, Stuart Brand. But anyway, I was living in Toronto and connected with the people that were editing the Whole Earth Almanac. And I was asked to edit an issue on healing. And so I did extensive, research and reading, including about Dr. Rolf. I had actually thought of going to Esalen to train with her, but this was during the Vietnam War and things were very complicated, so it didn't end up going there. And so I interviewed osteopaths, chiropractors, radionics practitioners. Radionics was really big in Canada at the time. herbal healers. So just covering the whole range of healing. So I got very interested in just the field of healing in general. But then I ended up coming to the Zen Center, and that became my full-time activity. I was on the staff of the Rochester Zen Center. So it was a 24 hours a day for 15 years at the Zen Center. So I'm coming from a background, in meditation practice, spiritual inquiry, and so on. When I left the Zen Center, it was just time to leave after 15 years. I had a family that was growing up. I needed to spend more time with my son. And so when I left, we had moved to Santa Fe at that point to start a Zen Center, which is still going. It's the Mountain Cloud Zen Center here in Santa Fe. And so when I left and was trying to figure out what direction to go, Jan Sultan and I were just personal friends that preceded the Rolf Institute. Like our kids were in school together, and we used to take the kids hiking and got to know each other through the school. And Jan said, well, why don't you, I'll help you become a Rolfer. I'm teaching my last basic class next year. So here's what you have to do to be able to be in that class. And so that was really my kind of avenue into Rolfing, was through Jan. And at that point, the training was auditing and practitioner. It was before the phase 3-phase model. And so I was in Jan's class here, the last class, basic class he taught, as an auditor. And Jeff Maitland was the assistant. And Gail, I think her name right now is Lovett. She was the movement teacher for that. And I became really good friends with Jeff Maitland in that class because Jeff has a background in Zen also. Jeff has been a Zen practitioner for 50 years at this point. And so that was kind of my way in. And Jan in that class was teaching the 10 series as a ritual. He said the 10 series is a ritual that you're taking people through. And so that was a kind of a different orientation than I think that most of the classes are at this point. But there was a very, this was 38 years ago, 40 years ago. So there was a very different orientation in the Rolfing world at that point. I did my practitioning with Tom Wing. And at that point, Tom was talking about how people that had a background in the arts and crafts made much better Rolfers than people that came from the scientific medical world or massage world or PT world. So Tom really resonated with my background as an artist and Zen practitioner and so on. So that was a really good class. And
hey, Bob, may I interrupt you? Could you, from your basic training, when you said Jan Sultan was saying he's teaching it from a spiritual, what did you call it?
I said he taught the 10 series as a ritual that you're taking.
Ritual, sorry. Can you speak to that just a little bit? What stands out to you in the teaching that felt like a ritual?
Well, just that, I talked to Pedro about this too, Pedro Prado, when I was in Brazil once. And, he said that, when he first started Rolfing, that's how he viewed it. And that, he would often have quite frequently, Pedro came from a background as a psychotherapist, not a body worker. And, he said, I would often have people bring in drawings and journal writings, dream journals to their sessions after. And this was actually a very common phenomenon at that point, that, the work was seen as a path of personal development rather than a biomechanical process. And so that's what was happening when I became a Rolfer was, people would bring in journals and dream journals and drawings and so on. So there was a really different orientation to the work as being part of the human potential movement. And this came out of, Dr. Rolf teaching at Esalen. I had this opportunity a few years ago. I have a good friend who's one of Stan Grof's main teachers of the holotrophic breathwork. And she was having this little gathering. We live next door to them. And the gathering were all really old timers from Esalen. And they had all been there when Dr. Rolf was there. And when I told them that I was a Rolfer and we started talking about the early days of Rolfing, they said, you have absolutely no idea what was going on at Esalen at that point. Esalen was kind of the hub of, the Grateful Dead were there, Ken Kesey was there, Osley was there. It was kind of the center of, Fritz Perls. I mean, it was really the center of what was known as the human potential movement. And it was intimately involved with the 60s and LSD and the hippie movement. And all of that was happening at Esalen. That's the background that Rolfing first emerged in, was there before they moved to Boulder.
When I'm in Boulder, and it's amazing that since the school has been here forever, that a lot of people still don't know about it. And then what they do know, I just find it kind of funny. I get often one of these two responses of, "Ooh, I've been curious, but that sounds painful," or "Ooh, I've been curious, but I'm not in the mood to start crying."
Yeah, well, there's a legitimate reason for that. I certainly learned heavy-handed Rolfing. Although Tom Wing had a little different approach. Rolfing was, people were bruised during sessions. It was really tough for people to go through that in those days. That was before the days of softer Rolfing and the biodynamic influence and all the other influences that have come in that have kind of taken us in a different direction as a community. So to get back to how, SourcePoint emerged out of all of this, once I started actually practicing, I had a real inquiry about why some people didn't respond as well to the work, why they didn't get better, why they didn't hold the work, and so on. And so I began working with my partner, Donna Thomson. The SourcePoint work is really a co-project with my partner, Donna, and myself. Donna wrote the book. There are hundreds of blogs on our website that she's written about SourcePoint and different aspects of SourcePoint. And, she's, I guess what you would say is a intuitive or channel. And so I began working with her to kind of investigate why people weren't improving or getting better. So this work really emerged in concert with both of us, with me asking questions. And, sometimes this is, some people have a hard time relating to that. But, I had kind of an eye-opening experience at one point in my Rolfing practice, because I had someone come into my office for some Rolfing sessions, and I asked her, I said, "Have you ever had any Rolfing sessions before?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, who with?" She said, "Dr. Rolf." She said, "I had 30 or 40 sessions with Dr. Rolf." And so I thought, okay, this is a golden opportunity. So I asked her, "Well, what was your experience with Dr. Rolf? What do you remember?" And she said two things. One was exactly what you were just talking about, that it was excruciating and extremely painful. That was her first response. Her second response was, I remember all the stories that she used to tell me while she was working. And I said, "Are there any of those stories that you feel like you can share?" And she said, "Well, the main story that I can remember, and because it made such a deep impression on me, was that Dr. Rolf told me during those sessions that the Rolfing work was channeled information from ancient Egypt. It didn't come from my scientific background." So, and I started asking around some of the older people that were around during the excellent times. They all said the same thing. There are people who deny this vehemently. There's some Rolfers that really push back on this. I've written several articles for the Rolf Journal in which I detail this story. So those are there. So I felt like when I started working with my partner, Donna, to investigate this, that it was really very much in the same vein as the origins of the work. So over time, that the work began emerging. And I had also done my advanced training. It was the first advanced training where the focus was not on the Advanced 5 series that used to be taught. And that was with Jeff Maitland and Michael Salveson. And one of the things that we talked about was the taxonomies. At that point, the taxonomic point of view was entering the training and the teaching. And, one of the taxonomies is the energetic taxonomy. It's in that taxonomic model. And so Jeff said, I think we can, we're kind of looking at this together. Jeff went in a little bit different direction, but not that much different. He said, "Why don't you go back and reread Dr. Rolf's book, the structural integration book, as well as Rosemary Fidus's book on Dr. Rolf Speaks." So I reread that book about 5 times because I didn't see what he was talking about the first couple of times through. And then I realized what Jeff was talking about, because Dr. Rolf in her book talks about, in the very first chapter, about that there is a Platonic blueprint for the structure of the human being. And she also says in that book, she said that she uses perhaps, but she says, perhaps there is an energetic structure that is undisturbed by trauma and the vicissitudes of life. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. I don't remember the exact quote, but that's basically what she says. And then she says, in that energetic pattern is self-maintaining, it's sentient. So it's right there in her original book. It kind of gets glossed over if you're just looking at all the anatomical and structural details that are in that book. But, and in the Dr. Rolf Speaks, by Rosemary Fidus. She says, what makes Rolfers different from everybody else is that we are focusing on health. We're not focusing on illness or disease. We're focusing on health. And that you as Rolfers must understand this. This is what you're doing. Your focus is on health. So all of that kind of fed back into my explorations with my partner, Donna, and looking at these bigger issues of how does healing happen? How do we evoke health? Because she says in that quote in the Rosemary Fidus book that what you as Rolfers are doing is invoking and evoking health. Okay, so that's a very different perspective about what the work is about. It's not just about balancing the body in the field of gravity, which was, also one of her main contribution. But this emphasis on health is there in her initial work. And, Andrew is someone who was in Ray's class. You may have heard this. Ray always likes to quote Dr. Rolfe at one of the last annual meetings that she was at, where she says, you want to know what Dr. Rolfe, what I think, what I'm interested in, I will tell you what I'm interested in. And then she goes into this whole monologue about, I want to see better energy fields, better functioning. It's all focused on the energetic makeup of the individual. She doesn't even mention gravity in that talk. So all of these things just started, coalescing. And I think in the very beginning, when I was looking at these questions about how to sustain the work and why people weren't responding, is well, I'm not sure where I was going with that.
You were mentioning, first off, I want to just say thank you for reminding and reiterating the importance of the work isn't just about fix it, getting out of pain, structure, that there is this other really big part of orienting to health. And and I think it's important just to kind of say this because I think a little bit, and maybe this is just from my lens, but often when we are talking about our bodies, it's almost kind of coming from a place that we're broken, or this isn't working, or right. I'm not good in, like all these stories of not being good enough or efficient enough. And that our bodies are brilliant and want to orient to health. And sometimes it just needs a little support to get there, but we're not, in fact, just these broken people that are constantly chasing to be fixed.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
I think you were mentioning kind of your inspiration of developing the work with Donna. And I want to continue talking about that, but could you share a little bit, just because Donna seems so important in the role of developing SourcePoint? Like what's her background and how was she inspired for this as well?
Okay. Donna and I met at the Zen Center in Rochester. So she was a long-term Zen student also. So that's where that came from. And it was that extensive meditation background that began opening the doorways for her to, she's not a channel in the traditional sense of the word of channeling spirits and so on. She does what she calls awareness sessions, which we can talk more about when we start talking about presence. So from that greater perspective of awareness, she's able to look at various things. And so it was through that process that the work developed. Would not have developed without that.
Yeah.
And the three modules of SourcePoint, Module 1, Module 2, Module 3, are pretty much the order in which the information came through.
Can you share,
Cool.
give us a little brief cliff notes of what that is?
Yeah, so Module 1 of SourcePoint, we are looking at the basic foundation of working with points in the energy field that connects us directly to the blueprint of health. And then we're learning two scans with our hands, manual therapy scans. If you've studied visceral manipulation, there's a manual scan that's done. These scans are a little different. The manual therapy scan and visceral manipulation is fairly quick. And they talk about moving quickly so that you're not absorbing the heat of the person you're working with. But these scans are much slower. And there are the two scans, or the first scan is looking for where the entry point is in terms of working with someone. In other words, everyone has a place that their body and whole being would prefer that you start. And so with that scan, that entry point scan opens up a whole lot of territory. There was a period in my time when I had several AIDS patients. And when I would do this entry point scan, they would all say, you could not have picked a better place to make your initial contact. So that's the beginning, making appropriate contact in a place on the body that really resonates with the whole being, the whole system. So that's one scan. The second scan is a scan for what we call primary blockage, like where's the primary blockage that's obstructing the flow of information of the blueprint. So that pretty much is what we learn in Module 1, the working with energetic points around the body, working with some points on the body, like the navel point and the sacral point, and then those scans. So that's a 3-day workshop. So there's a lot of information in that. The second workshop is working with what we call energetic structures. And, the energetic structures are, just as we work within the Rolfing world, the midline is an energetic structure. We work within midline as an energetic structure that carries the information of the blueprint. We're also working with another group of points on the body that we call the guardian points that have to do with the guardian function within the body. There are many systems in the body that are guardian systems, the immune system, the guardian proteins. So these guardian points are to help that process of guardianship. And then we're working with the stick figure, which is basically the midlines, and the palintonicity model. We're talking about span between two joints. And so what we call the stick figure, just the midline of the arm, midline of the fingers, midline of the core, midline of the legs, toes, pelvic girdle, shoulder girdle. So that energetic structure is extremely helpful for people who are doing structural integration. It's how I do most of my structural integration. is working with that energetic structure. And we're working with that energetic structure because it's a manifestation of the blueprint in the structure of the human body. And we see that all over the world. What's one of the most common things you see worldwide? Stick figures, petroglyphs, all over the world. What do children draw? They draw a stick figure. Even in, say, a sophisticated cave site like Lascaux, where they painted very detailed drawings of animals. They knew how to draw, but they still did stick figures for the human being. And there's a reason for that. That's the underlying energetic structure. And if you look at the really early acupuncture texts, some of them have drawings of the original meridians in acupuncture. And the original meridians in acupuncture were the stick figure. Exactly the same thing. So that's another thing we're working with in Module 2. We're working with a single point. This brings up another point that's really important in the SourcePoint work, is from the SourcePoint perspective, the therapeutic relationship between client and therapist is not, is not a dyad. It's a triad. So you have client and therapist, and you have a third point. And that third point, from the SourcePoint perspective, is the information of health, or the blueprint of health. And so, you're working to both connect your client with that blueprint and yourself. So it's not a, dyad. It's not dualistic. We add this other point. And I think this will, when we get to talking about presence, this is also related to this notion of presence. It's not presence in the sense of having a strong personality or being present in the world. It's the presence of a third force. Just like Dr. Rawls said that there was a energetic pattern that is that's sentient. So that's what we're working with. We're working with the blueprint as that third point, as the operating factor. So that's where the healing really is coming from, is from that third point. We're just, as practitioners, we're just facilitators. And I think that was embedded in the early Rolfing work. Gravity was the third point. Dr. Rawls said many, many times, gravity is the therapist. That's what she was pointing to, that there is something else besides her skill set that is the therapist. And different people talk about this different way. In the biodynamic world, they talk about the blueprint carried by the breath of life. So they're also referring to the blueprint as the operating factor. So
yeah, I was going to actually bring up a little bit about the biodynamics, Bob, and maybe it's a good time. Sure. Because one of the things, as I understand it, is when you were saying before about orienting to health, this is a part of some schools of osteopathy. I don't know if it's all schools of osteopathy anymore. I think originally it was with AT Still, but things have changed. But in the biodynamic world, especially for Jim Jealous and people who were following his work, as I understand it, again, it was all about orienting to health. And even when I would read some of Jim's book, he talks a lot about staying in health. And I don't know if that's similar to the same aspect of the third point, but it's a lot about really, when I'm working from that where I am right now, it's not about, you do sort of separate, I sort of separate the person I keep awareness of the person, but also about the health residing within that, and not looking for the illness, but really the health, and separating myself as well from it, and having that that not dyad, but that relative non-dual, or something along that lines spot. And so I hear similarities, and of course there's going to be similarities across a lot of spectrums. But I'm curious, was that model being brought in, or was it more of a health has a finite ways of looking at it?
Well, this notion of, health as the operating factor is there historically throughout history in the healing world. And that's one of the things that in the presentation for Module 1, what that presentation is going through all the different spiritual and esoteric and, practical ways that people have talked about this notion of a blueprint. It's there in almost every tradition. The blueprint for the human being. It's just kind of embedded in I guess you would say, in practices that are oriented and towards more what you might call vitalism. There's this whole school of vitalism, and rather than illness and disease, looking at terrain theory came out of that. So it's a really old tradition. It's not just there. The whole, the term biodynamic, originally came from Rudolf Steiner, and it was picked up, by other, German anatomy people, and Blechschmidt and people like that. I was doing some research at one point and found a passage from Blechschmidt, and he says during the embryonic development, the cells migrate along the stick figure. And it's just these things in passing that are said, but you go, okay, what was he talking about? So this notion of, biodynamic was a term Rudolf Steiner used for his work with plants. Biodynamic gardening came out of that. The whole Waldorf school education curriculum came out of that. He was talking about etheric formative forces. That was one of his main focus, and that's what led to the development of, homeopathic remedies, preparations for the garden from herbs and horns and hooves and so on. All of that was in an effort to connect with these formative forces. And, he was influenced by Goethe, the great German philosopher and poet, who had this whole notion of the Ur-phenomena, the Ur-human, the Ur-pflanze, the Ur-plant. And, this is kind of the direction that Jeff Maitland went in talking more about phenomenology and the Ur phenomena. Ur simply means primordial. So I want to back up for a minute, because I'm remembering when I had that memory gap for a minute. I think when we first started working on developing this work, I think myself and I think Ray, we thought that we were working towards developing the energetic taxonomy within the Rolf Institute. That did not happen for a variety of political reasons and so on. And so at that point, I really separated the work from the Rolf Institute and started teaching outside of the Rolf Institute. And, there's still a lot of Rolfers that take the training, but the training is attract people, acupuncturists, psychotherapists, medical doctors, clients of people, your clients, my clients. So the bulk of the people taking the training at this point are not just in the structural integration world. They're coming from a much broader spectrum, because the work can really be done by anybody. You don't have to have a background in anatomy or structural work. So we kind of took that, and it was in when I turned 60, which was 17 years ago, that we decided that we named it SourcePoint, and it became its own thing, rather than just an energetic taxonomy of Rolfing.
I guess there's pros and cons to that. The pros being anyone can do it, right? You don't need to be an SI background. And one of the cons is that we have a beautiful space to actually grow the energetic taxonomy of SI. And yet, due to various political reasons, and I know you're not the only person that had political issues and left and started your own school. I know that's a common theme, but in some ways it's sort of a shame, because here we have a way to grow, and we're sort of put aside.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we're actually put aside too much. It's really interesting. And I think this will continue to change. Like here we are talking. I still have, Rolfers trickling into classes. There are a couple of Rolfers in Germany who are teaching SourcePoint, who are teaching Rolfers there, actually. There's much more of a tradition in Europe of, Goethe, Rudolf Steiner, Joseph Beuys, all of these philosophers and artists that were, connected to the more spiritual dimension of the work. So it's a little easier jump for some of the European Rolfers because of that rich philosophical background and spiritual background. So it's still there. We're still chipping away. And, there have been, I think, 3 articles in the Yasi Journal about SourcePoint. I wrote one, Ray and I wrote one. Corey Hess, a SI practitioner, wrote one. I've had 3 articles in the Rolf Journal about this. So it's still, don't give up hope.
Well, and I think, and I know we're going to talk about the word presence because of the fact that it's overused and what does it mean? But I'll say it in the terms of with working, if the energetic is undeniably there, like if you are in fact being present with your client, and even I don't even think you have to have all these know of all the others out there, whether you're talking about SourcePoint, Biodynamic. But I remember, and maybe this is because of my, I had Ray McCall and Thomas Walker as my case too.
Yeah.
So in my training, it was very much learning the 10 series, but the energetics was spoken about a little bit. And then when I went off and did my, I was certified opening up my practice, I was feeling stuff, and it was beyond just the tissue, the person. And that's why, the energetics aspect isn't something that I've taken a great deep dive in, but I did Upledger, I did your SourcePoint because I wanted to know more and be like, okay, what is this that I'm feeling beyond just fascia, the body, and hold presence for it, whether or not I was, masterminding some kind of technique. No, but I feel like by holding that dialogue and being present with it, it's just part of the work. Yeah.
Well, Ray just sent me an article a couple of weeks ago. It was an article that Jeff Maitland had written about the taxonomies. And one of the things that he says in there is that, as a practitioner, you need to be able to determine within what taxonomy he uses this odd word, order thwarter. But he says you need to be able to determine within which taxonomy the major blockage to order emerging lies.
That sounds like a Dr. Seuss word.
Yeah, it does, order thwarter. But I think it's easier just to say blockage. But what I've seen, where it becomes problematic, I think, for the structural integration world, is that if you're open to that level of the work, or just you're wired that way, you begin to see that the major blockages to order emerging in the system are very rarely at the structural level. They're at the level of trauma, which we've become more aware of as a community and the teaching. They're at the level of karma. They're at the level of emotions. They're at the level of ancestral patterns. They're at the level of belief systems. That's where, and we work at all those levels within SourcePoint. Module 3, I didn't get to module 3, but module 3 is really focusing on all those different levels: trauma, karma, emotion, and how to work at those different levels from this perspective of the blueprint of health.
Yeah, and I don't remember where I heard this from, and it may have been from a Rolfer or not, but you can't have physics without metaphysics and vice versa.
Uh-huh.
So you start looking at structure, it's great. And that's what brought me into it. But then as you go on, you start to see, trauma is not a physical thing. It might manifest physically, but it itself is a metaphysical. Same with the karma, same with emotion, same with all this stuff. And so to start to look at how all these things are affecting structure in my own practice has been very transformative.
Yeah. And a good analogy of this is or a good example, when I first started Rolfing, I had this client who was a psychiatrist, and he had this limp, really severe limp. And that's what he came to me for. He wanted to be able to walk better, purely biomechanical issue, he thought. But after one session, we were working, and he was walking. I was watching him walk, and he wasn't limping all of a sudden. And he said, "Oh my gosh," he said, I grew up with my grandfather. My grandfather raised me, and my grandfather had a limp. And that's how I learned how to walk." So, so that real, so there's a good example of, the main blockage was not in his structure, it was in his ancestral lineage. So,
something that was occurring to me, and I've actually thought about this before, but I didn't know about you in this, which is thinking, and I think this would be a nice way to tie into presence, actually, because we've talked about this a bit, and you asked for the listeners out there, when we emailed you, you were like, "What is touching to presence?" And that was really a curiosity, and something that, some of the people who've affected me greatly in this work have been Jeff Maitland, have been Kevin Frank, and have been, I think you, even though I haven't studied with you, there's a curiosity that's opened up. And I think you've affected a lot of people in this. In a similar, or a commonality between the three of you in particular, is Zen. And
yes.
you've all sat in Zendos before, and I think I've had relatively higher level or higher, status up there. And I would imagine, and I'm taking a guess, and this would be an end of sorts, but sitting in Zen is sitting with presence of some sort, and that possibly that is why in particular you three, although I don't want you to speak for them, but there's something within that presence that has led to more.
Yeah, I would agree. Kevin and I were at the same Zen center, actually. So I've known Kevin for since I was 27 years old, 50 years. And I would say it's definitely, it depends on within the Zen world, it depends on what school you're in, how you're sitting and what you're doing. There is a practice in Zen that's called shikantaza, which is just sitting, which I think is what you're more referring to. And I would say, but it's the presence, even there is the presence of awareness. That's what you're sitting in. And, the Tibetan Buddhists talk about the same thing, the Dzogchen, the Vajrayana. They're all talking about sitting in this naked awareness. That's the term in Tibetan Buddhism, naked awareness. And I think that a background in that certainly helps you as a practitioner. There's no doubt about that. Was there something specific about, Jeff and Kevin that you?
No, I think more just the fact that they've all had extensive Zen backgrounds, and as do you. And so there's something about, and I'm not Zen is not my bigger area of expertise. I know a lot more about Theraveda and Vajrayana and a bit about Mahayana, and I know that Zen is a subset in some ways of Mahayana. So I know there's sitting. I don't know that much about it in general. My understanding is that it's a non-dual practice.
Yes.
Right. And so within non-duality, you presence becomes very important, because that's really all there is. So I think I was in some way trying to lead us into this point by that, but I would imagine there is a similarity there, because when one is able to sit with and be in that presence, I don't want to say it makes things easier, because I've actually found that it makes a lot of things more difficult, but that it from a sitting with a client or sitting with understanding, it in some way it just makes the field more big, because the field is infinite, and at the same point there is no field.
Yeah. So in the discussion that Ray and I are having right now, one of the things that we're talking about is, we're talking about what we would teach in a class that's focused more on this element of presence. And both of us have felt that it would be extremely difficult to do a class like that without having part of the class be a meditative practice.
For 100%. I mean, this is something, and in my background, I do have a meditative background through yoga, but even as a child, I started doing it sort of accidentally as a way to relieve stress. I don't really know how I did that, but I did. And I have trouble, and I'm going to probably upset people listening who don't understand how people can be body workers or any sort of quote unquote healer modality without having a meditative being any sort of introspective practice. It doesn't have to be just sitting. There are other practices. But I struggle with that. And of course I'm biased because I have that, but it doesn't make sense, because I just find for myself when I'm in periods of sitting more, my work is much easier and much more transformative for the people I'm working with.
Yeah, exactly. And what we're at a point right now is that, when Ray and I first started teaching the SourcePoint classes at the Rolf Institute, the Rolfing community basically related to the SourcePoint as another technique or another, way they could orient to the work. And what we're seeing, and this is really Donna's specialty, is that it's absolutely necessary that if you want to be a good practitioner, that you have some practice that is oriented towards developing a greater awareness. And this is why she calls her work awareness sessions, where you sit together in a state of awareness and dialogue within that presence of that awareness. So I would agree that, so we're just kind of moving, like this fall, Donna and another person that she's working with are going to teach more of a meditative workshop for SourcePoint practitioners that's going to focus on awareness and developing awareness as the ground of SourcePoint.
Well, I think that's great. One of my biodynamic teachers, whenever we start any training, it's usually we sit for 20 to 30 minutes before every class.
Uh-huh.
And I find that really helpful. I want to actually go back, and this will relate, but I'm curious, this has a lot to do with awareness, because when you were talking how you started with SourcePoint and you were sort of noticing how I heard it, you were noticing why did Rolfing work on some people and not on other people? And you're trying to kind of figure this out. And are you familiar with Eugene Genlin?
No, I don't know.
Eugene Genlin developed a practice called focusing that has fused in many psychology and bodywork practices. And Eugene Genlin he's the one who developed the word felt sense, or developed the phrase felt sense, or sometimes known as the felt sense of awareness. And he was the same thing. He was a philosopher that said, why is it psychology works sometimes and not, well, for some people and not others? And he wanted to find that basically what is the essence of it. And from that came this very basic didactic process called focusing, which is learning how to have awareness of your thoughts and your emotions in your body, and where body awareness was.
Yeah.
So it's infused in many other practices now. But it's very interesting to me because it was more or less the same reason of how you got to it. And it's a way of starting to be more aware of awareness itself.
Yeah, exactly. Awareness of awareness is really what the ground of SourcePoint, actually. You should have a conversation with Donna about this at some point.
I'd love to. We'll have to exchange information. One thing I also want to mention before, you did mention there is a SourcePoint book, and so we will put a link into that in our notes so that people can have access to it easier. Is the SourcePoint book helpful only for people who've taken the training, or is it good for anybody?
No, it's good for anybody. It's an introduction for people that have no medical background, or it's written for the general public. It's not a how-to book. You won't learn how to do SourcePoint, but it gives the background that we've been talking about, my background, Donna's background in therapy and social work, and how she came to what she came to. And then it discusses all the general principles that we talked about, in module 1, 2, and 3. So it gives a general outline of SourcePoint. And, for people who are not professional body workers, they're able to use this work for themselves and for their family or friends. So there's a bigger audience.
Cool. Thanks. And because we have already started talking about presence and we've gone a bit in, but it seemed when I was reading the emails back and forth, it seemed like something you were very interested in. And I care as well about you teaching a class with Ray or working on a workshop with Ray about it, which I think would be great. I want to just make sure, because we like to make all of our guests satisfied. Have we spoken enough about it for you, or is there more you want to sort of dive into? Because one of the things in the email you did mention was about I'll paraphrase you, the overuse of words like presence and embodiment, which I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah. Well, yes, I think, there was a during the pandemic, last year, there was a large online conference on embodiment. I don't know if you were aware of that. It was like 3,000 people attended that conference. My son did a presentation at that conference. And for some reason, that word embodiment has become something that people are focusing on within the somatic therapy world. And I feel like it's in some cases it's become synonymous with being a good movement person, being a good martial artist or a good dancer, or, being able to use your body in a certain way. And I had this discussion with Jeff, actually, a few years ago. We had a faculty meeting in Phoenix with Jeff. And I asked him, I said, Jeff, why aren't you teaching Rolfing classes anymore? And he said, well, I don't feel like I can embody the work. So we had a discussion about this word embodiment, because my feeling is that the word embodiment is really pointing to each of us being more who we are, fully who we are. It doesn't have to do, like I have a background in the martial arts. I take Qigong lessons every week. I do Feldenkrais lessons. I do physical therapy 5 days a week. I know the importance of movement and moving well. But to me, that doesn't have much to do with embodiment.
Yeah, I mean, there's Jeff's background as a philosophy professor he's a slightly different, and I know from reading his work and from studying a bit about it, the phenomenology, in particular, Maurice Merleau-Ponty was one of the people who first actually kind of brought embodiment into this realm of thought, the embodied being. But I hear you very much about this sort of the movement world, and I'm going to be I'm traveling tonight to a country whose name I don't want to mention, because I don't want to have anyone hearing me talk about them. But there's a few people who teach embodied yoga, but they're just teaching movement, and they've got this beautiful catchphrase. And I think they know very little bit about what it actually means to live in their body. They know how to move their body somewhat. And I find it hard to talk about embodiment, because it's a very personal thing that is hard to actually explain, because it's not really a physiological, it's just this mix. However, I know when I work with my clients and I see other people, I can see when they're, from my view, more embodied, when they're moving more at ease with less thoughts, when they are, how their body moves as a representation, not of a physiological being, but of a emotional, physical, all of that being. And when someone is that, I hear that as you're saying, like their truest self, or getting to their truest self. I mean, I think we all have layers or sheets that are called culture, that are called education, that are life experiences that cover the embodied essence of us. But through practices like this, we start to find that Feldenkrais, as you mentioned, can be a beautiful embodied practice. It can also be a very procedure based. Do this, and so it's less about feeling in and becoming aware, which is how I understand Moshe developed it, and more into a step-by-step protocol.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a little story about that. I have a good friend who's an international Feldenkrais teacher. He teaches all over the world. He was at Moshe's original classes, one of his original students. And we trade work. And the first time I worked on him, he stood up and he started walking around. And he said, "I'm walking completely differently than I ever have." And, it wasn't because he had done his Feldenkrais lessons or, that the information for how we function as human beings is contained in the blueprint. And, the more that we can connect to that and bring that present, the more people will start moving in a more embodied way that's appropriate for them. Because if you look at the movement work, what you learn in Bagua, what you learn in Qigong, is very different than what you learn in the Rolfing movement work about what good movement is. If you look at Ido Portal, the movement work, that's very different than the Feldenkrais work or the Rolfing movement work. So there
Although, a funny thing about that, I have a client who's an Ido higher level student, and when they do big trainings, Ido brings in SI people to work on them when they're not moving.
Yeah, of course. I'm I don't want to give the wrong impression here. I'm a big fan of SI work. I think SI work is one of the hands-on modalities that's actually most aligned with what we're talking about. Because it's in, whether people remember it or not, Dr. Rolf was coming from this place that there is a Platonic blueprint for the structure of the human being. That's embedded in her vision, whether we know it or not. So, I'm not surprised that he would do that.
Well, I think we've already kind of mentioned this, that embodiment isn't necessarily about how you're moving. It's an expression, but embodiment is the ability to be able to hear yourself and to learn from yourself, and with those lessons to orient to health and all the other things, structural integration, Rolf movement, all these kind of holistic modalities are offerings to tap into that potential. Because the way I see it is structural integration, although it's wonderful, it's not for everyone. There might be something else out there that suits their interests, their influences, that help them find that. It just so happens, we're probably all a little biased because we all do structural integration and that's kind of our root. But yeah, I feel like, I've done some meditation, but where I find deep meditation sometimes is in somatic movement.
Sure.
With allowing my body, and it's super fun. Like, I have a yoga wall behind me. I've tapped into all sorts of modalities that kind of have a way to do it. And while it's fun to do that way, because it also can be community-based, we all kind of know something and we're doing it together, and there's a flow and there's a connection with that. What's also super fun is going off script and letting your body lead. And when your body's leading, you're kind of leading into what feels good. And then you might find something that doesn't feel so good, but you can dance in that exploration and, work it out. Whatever thing is coming up for you, find ways to work it out for yourself, or, I could go seek help for this. And that, to me, that having that dialogue with yourself, that is an expression of embodiment. Doing something with it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that, that's at the forefront of, continuum work, the continuum movement work. You're working with what movements emerge from your body, starting with very small microscopic movements and then letting those become bigger, like you're talking about. I know Emily Daoud used to teach in Albuquerque. I used to go to her workshops in Albuquerquerque many years ago. And, and she talked about the continuum work as a meditative practice. That was very much at the heart of it. And it's built into Qigong, it's built into Tai Chi. It's built into a lot of movement modalities so when we talk about meditation, the Buddha talked about, there are 4 postures for meditation: sitting, walking, standing, lying down. And in the Zen world, for instance, you sit for half an hour, you walk for 10 minutes. When I did my Vipassana training in Sri Lanka many years ago, I spent as many hours walking, doing walking meditation, as I did sitting meditation. So, meditation isn't confined to sitting cross-legged on a cushion. But I think what I was trying to get at is in this terms of discussion about embodiment, if you take someone like Ramana Maharshi, the great spiritual teacher, he had terrible posture, pretty poor health overall. But he was embodied. He was embodying that presence of awareness. To me, that's what embodiment is. It's like true embodiment is someone who's able to transmit that awareness.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. It reminds me, it's a little different. I don't think I've shared this on the podcast, but maybe I have. I was once in a meditation training, and I was doing everything I could to have perfect posture, and I was just in agony. And at some point, I just said, "Fuck it," and I dropped, and I went into this really poor posture, which my body needed. And as soon as I did that, I was gone. I was out for a while in space because I didn't need. I was putting an idea of what I was supposed to be doing, which wasn't what I needed to be doing. And when I kind of dropped that, it was great.
Yeah, and the difficulty with a lot of these, like say Ido Portal's work, many years ago, this was before he got really popular. I ran across his work, and I called him up on the phone, and that was 17 years ago. I was 60. And I said, would you be willing to work with me online? Because I was available at that, starting to become available. And he said, yeah, I'd be glad to work with you under one condition. And his one condition was that I spent a minimum of 3 to 4 hours a day doing the work. So, that's what I'm talking about. The movement work is profound. And I have tremendous respect for everybody doing, they're dedicating themselves to his work or to the, Tai Chi or whatever. But it's not going to come from just an hour Rolfing session. It requires that kind of dedicated practice to really be embodied in movement. I try to do, probably an hour or so of movement work a day, either Qigong or physical therapy or, whatever. It's really hard even to get an hour a day in. And, I know that my limits in movement are coming from my lack of time to put into it. So
I fully understand. I'm in the same place right now when I'm currently kind of in between apartments, we'll say lives, countries, a lot of stuff. And I'm in Massachusetts right now with my wife, who is quasi stuck here in the meantime while we deal with green card processes. So when I come here right now in her space, there's not really much space for movement as well as time, because we don't see each other. I haven't seen, I'm leaving for 2 months. So we're we want to absorb the time, which is great. My body feels it. And also my personality. We spent the last weekend with a client who has a big barn, and I would go every morning for an hour and roll around the floor and move and do TRX, and it was great. and I'm super happy and wonderful. And then I come back and I'm stagnant, and I am definitely not the most embodied of myself I can be, for sure. So I can relate to that. And it's always just a good reminder of just, it's always time. It's just making it.
Yes. So I think that, the one thing I would just caution you about is just because you're not doing that doesn't mean you're not embodied.
No, for sure. But I am aware that, I guess one part I could say, well, the awareness of the unawareness is still an awareness, and we can go into that aspect. Yeah. But I am aware that, I guess what I'd say is I'm aware that I am not as full of a person as I can be.
Right.
Or there's an ability, there's an essence that I have the ability to get to, but at this moment I am not accessing that. It doesn't mean I'm disembodied, or I am not the best version of myself. And one of the things I think of when I think of what, be it rolfing or be it any of these sort of practices or working towards embodiment, is how can you be the quintessential version of self? Because that's where print is. Yeah. Right. So how do you access that? And it's okay to not always, because you're not going to be 100% perfect. So the imperfections of the self are perfect. You need to fall in order to stand up. I get that. And I'm content with it. I would rather have time with my wife, who's taking a nap right behind us. But yeah, it's just sort of recognizing that, and I can feel that. I feel it in my joints, and I feel it in my personality.
Yeah. So, everybody's wired differently. So, somebody else might say, like, I have a client that I see every week who's a world-class jazz and classical musician. He's considered to be #1 clarinet player in the world. He practices it. He's 3 years older than I am. So he's 80. He still practices 6 to 8 hours a day. He doesn't do movement work. He's not a great, his posture is terrible even after hundreds of rolfing sessions. This clarinet player, but I would say he's embodied. Even though he's got bad posture, doesn't do movement work, he is fully who he is. He's totally immersed himself. He said, "This is how I became world famous." He said, "Everybody knows me as a practitioner." He said, "Everybody knows I practice 6 to 8 hours a day." So it's so that there's a good example of somebody who's embodied, from my perspective, but he's a terrible movement person and has terrible posture, from his occupation. So I think so. If movement is part of who you are, then yes, it's part of your embodiment. But there are a lot of people for whom movement is not a part of who they are.
Yeah, I think for me, I don't know if it's who I am or who I believe I need to be, which will take us on a separate story, which we don't necessarily have time for. And I know that we are coming close to time, at least from my point. And Nikki had something she did want to share, so I'm going to pass it over.
Yeah.
So speaking of being present, being very present in this podcast, I feel like we had a little cliffhanger with your client that you worked on, who received work from Ida, who had the heavy-handed work. Did you do SourcePoint type work with her? What was her response from receiving work from you?
Well, her response from receiving work from me after about 3 sessions, I think she felt that it wasn't rolfing. That she identified in her mind rolfing with heavy-handed work. So if I wasn't doing heavy-handed work, she had good results. We got accomplished what she wanted to accomplish, but I'm pretty sure that she felt like this is not what Dr. Rolf was doing.
Yeah, I think we're still wrestling with that, with the historical start of the touch aspect.
Yeah.
Because I actually had a person come in to my office who just recently looked me up and down and said, well, I would want you to be bigger. And if the pressure isn't hard enough, then I'm just going to walk out.
Wow.
So
yeah, I've had clients like that. I've had clients who've been worked with other really heavy-handed rolfers, and I know how to do that work. I can do that work, but I prefer not to. But he insisted on it every single time, and finally, I just got tired of doing it, and that was the end of our relationship. Because so people have all kinds of expectations, and some people want.
Which, I mean, there's a need and a place, and I just want to honor your work in the energetic aspect, because I think that's what's really unique. We kind of touched a bit on that in the series of our podcast, but having worked with a little bit of myself in my own practice, but I've had the good fortune of being in the classroom with you, Ray McCall, Thomas Walker, other people who do orient a little bit more to the energetic work, and being in the classroom and insisting some of these people, or being a student, profound. I mean, it feels so magical when clients get off the table and are working, moving better, feeling better, experiencing the world in a more embodied, enlightened way, purely from working from more of an energetic point of view. And I think that's kind of what we've been talking about, is there is this other aspect of our being that gets overlooked. And there's...
And what you're saying, Nikki, I think is really true. And where the complication comes in is that some people think that because you're energetically oriented, that you're not going to accomplish the goals of the work. That's what it comes down to, whether it's another practitioner or your clients. And, I think, you've seen from, Ray's classes and Tom's classes and the SourcePoint class, you can get the results of the work. I mean, we have standards, right? For session one, you want to accomplish certain things. You can accomplish that with, in most cases, with energetic work. But having an energetic orientation doesn't mean that you don't do hands-on work. My orientation here is that the blueprint, if we relate to the blueprint of health as being sentient, or that greater health as being sentient, it will use whatever skill sets you have as a practitioner. So my so-called SourcePoint sessions, I'm using everything I learned in rolfing or in my biodynamic training. I have that background. I'm continuing, even now, I'm continuing to study and learn. And, the field of healing is huge. And, that awareness, that information of the blueprint, that energetic pattern that Dr. Rolf talked about, knows what skill sets you have. So someone who is working from an energetic perspective that has all the biomechanic skills that you have as a rolfer is going to be able to make better use of that. It's going to be able to do more. Does that make sense?
Totally. I'm 6'4". You can't see it on Zoom. I'm 6'4", anywhere from 210 to 220, depending on the day. I got into bodywork from living in Thailand and learning that, which can be very physical. And now I'm much more into biodynamics and of being in between, and of knowing, sometimes dropping an elbow into someone's IT band feels great for us both. Yeah. But it's sort of knowing when and how to move with that. And I like what you said. Here you are, if I did my math correct, 77, and you're still learning. And that's how I hope to be, is to always continue learning. Yeah. Let me ask you, for people who want to continue learning, I believe you're going to be offering classes again soon, correct?
Yeah. So we just made our schedule yesterday, and there are a lot of classes available. They're not all me or Donna. Usually Donna and I teach together. We have 6 people who are teaching the SourcePoint work at this point. 4 of them are Rolfers. So there's Hiro Sato in Osaka. He's teaching workshops all next year. There's Dave Sheldon in Boulder, who's a Rolfer, who's assisted Ray in many, many classes and me in many classes. So he's going to be teaching Module 1 and 2 this year. There is Andrea Klusen in Berlin, who teaches for the Rolf Institute. She's teaching Module 1 and 2 this year. There's Marisol Valente, who's a Brazilian Rolfer, who's going to be teaching workshops in Munich this year. A lot of those workshops are to the Rolfing community and biodynamic community. And then there's a retreat center in upstate New York, Sukuro. I can send you the information. We're going to be in residence there for 2 months, August and September. And Don and I will both be there teaching Module 1 and 2 with them, co-teaching with them. I'm also teaching a Module 1 in Seattle in November. Ann Hoff is organizing that. And that workshop is specifically for structural integration practitioners. So we'll be looking at much more at the integration of the structural integration work with this energetic perspective. And then I'm teaching a Module 1 in Toronto in April. So there are a lot of class opportunities coming up. And we'll have that schedule up on our website probably in a week.
We'll post a link to that so people can have it. And the good thing is it's going to take me a while to edit this all up, but I think there's still plenty of time that by the time I finish editing this, the classes will not have happened yet. So that'll be great.
No, they will not. Yeah.
Good. I really want to thank you for making time. It's been a pleasure to be in conversation with you and to get to know more about you and the work. I look forward to more conversations to come, whether in person or via email, because a lot of new curiosities have been piqued.
Yeah.
But I just really do want to thank you, as well as I now get to tick off one of the people on the list that I have. So I had just this queue, and it's like, yes, Bob Schrei is now moving from the wanted to the in progress, and eventually we'll move to completed. So that makes me feel great because I love lists.
So do you have 2 more minutes?
Yeah.
So I want to get back to Nikki's original question about painting.
Yes.
Because it relates to this issue of presence. And I'm just going to show you, I don't know if you can see.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the painting, Nikki, only I'm doing small versions for people. Mm-hmm. This is life size. And that painting contains all the information of SourcePoint.
It's such a teaser for the people who are listening because they don't get to see it, but they'll have to take a class and find out.
Yeah. So what happened was last year, a year ago, during the pandemic, a Rolfing colleague who studied SourcePoint was not working, and they called me up and they said, "Is there any chance you could do a smaller version of that painting for my office?" And we looked at it, and it takes me about 120 hours to do one of those small paintings. So that's 3 full weeks of work. And because of the pandemic, she didn't have the financial resources to pay much for the painting. So I said, why don't we put a notice up on the Facebook page, SourcePoint Facebook page, and see if anybody else is interested. If there are enough people, I may be able to shorten the time it takes me so that I can do these. And I ended up with 30 commissions. And that last one was number 15 on Instagram. And so I've completed 15 of those. And they're a way, like that painting has presence, to get back to that word, and it carries the presence of the blueprint of health for the human being. And when Tom Walker,
that's probably why I've been thinking about it.
Yeah, and it's based on Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. And it was interesting. Tom Walker was here for a workshop a couple years ago, and he said, I really got interested because sometimes I see when I'm doing my work, I see that Vitruvian Man, that image of the Vitruvian Man, just coming down into the person. And that drawing of Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man is, a modern, semi-modern, it's not today, but it's a Western civilization representation of the blueprint. So this painting is a representation, it's a doorway to the blueprint, is how I look at it. And so having that there right at the head of my table, that's the third point. That the presence that's carried in that painting, as far as I'm concerned, is working on the people on my table. So
that's great. That's great.
So it's also for me, it's an integration of my artistic path, interest in the healing, interest in pattern, interest in sacred geometry, all of these things put together. So. And
we will in the show notes, let people know, maybe you're going to get a big following. Let them know where to see these, because I know I see them because you post them ever so often.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking time with us. It has been such a pleasure to see you and to learn more about your work and how it all came to be.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Nikki, and it's nice to meet you, Andrew, and let's keep in touch.
Yeah, I'd love that.
Yes.
And please send Ray my best.
Yeah, I will.
Yeah.
I will.
I'm really great. I'm really grateful for him as a teacher and what doors he opened, aware or unawarely so.
Yeah, I'm talking to him this weekend, so I'll pass it on.
Great. Bob, thank you for everything. Have a great day out there.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great to talk to you both. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to us at Touching Into Presence. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. You can find out more about Bob at SourcePointTherapy.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd appreciate if you would leave a positive review of the podcast and subscribe to it to the platform of your choice. When you do this, it really helps other people find us, and we greatly appreciate your support. We look forward to hearing back from you and seeing you on our next conversation at Touching Into Presence. Bye for now.